So the question today is, how can we produce the nutritious food without exhausting the water, without damaging the ecosystems, or weakening the farmer livelihoods? On the contrary, there are also people who are eating enough but are still not able to have adequate nutrition, or the impact of the climate change and a water stress situation is created. So you're able to see the decline in the yields of major cereals or food crops. There is a need to switch for alternative cereals. So what are those alternative cereals? They are millets. So they are the ancient grains, and they are very relevant to the contemporary and a strategic choice for tomorrow. So I'm sure everybody thinks of some technologies, disruptions when you talk of the future of food. But the answer to this question is where silently the crops are being cultivated, or a particular group of crops are being cultivated in India and parts of the world. Maybe they have been oldest to the mankind, but today they are more relevant than ever. So that's the reason why millets matter more than ever is what is one of the taglines that's been chosen for this. So millets are small seeded, cereals or grasses. They belong to that particular family. So they are the ancient grains, and they are very relevant to the contemporary and a strategic choice for tomorrow. Why? Because in the coming slides, you will be able to understand the need for reviving millets, or rather the choice for millets to be a crop or mainstreaming them is the need of the hour today. So, if you could analyze the global food systems or Indian food systems per se, so the scenario is much more or less same. So, the cereals that dominate the food system are rice, wheat, maize, okay, and of course millets. Historically, millets were a part of this particular food system. If you see the statistics in the early 20th century, or mid 20th century, change started to happen, and then you started to see the rise of wheat, wherein rice and wheat were aggressively promoted through public funded programs or public policy, like procurement. So the technology, the green revolution that all of us talk about, and then credit guarantees that came in place, minimum support price that came in place, all of these led to a huge push, a policy push for rice and wheat. So they were strongly in their favor. And on the contrary, we could see drastic decline in the area of millets from 1960s to 2024. This picture only gives you on the area the trends, but perhaps the production and productivity levels, if you assess, I think millets are still better off. But the point I was trying to make here is these cereals were already integral part of our culture and traditions, but they have been declining over the years. That calls for understanding the reasons what went to the decline or what can be done to revive them. So through the efforts, we have succeeded in producing more calories, but the limitation for fewer crops is actually created by the advent of green revolution and subsequent technological changes. So that is when crops like millets have gone to the background. So with this understanding, I would like to tell you, so the world today faces multiple crises, actually, not just in one country or in one region. So climate change, then the global disruptions in terms of trade, and then the human challenges. Because see, there are people who are not having enough food to eat. On the contrary, there are also people who are eating enough but are still not able to have adequate nutrition. So there is where the problem of hunger, the obesity, the diet related diseases that we talk of, the lifestyle diseases that we talk of actually come into picture. Similar is the case in terms of earth or the planet, wherein you're able to witness the change of climate or the impact of the climate change, and a water stress situation is created. So you're able to you're able to see the decline in the yields of major cereals or food crops. And there is also degradation of the soil because of excessive or indiscriminate use of fertilizers for agriculture. And coming to the trade, you're able to see, because a war-like situation happens or a drought or a famine-like situation happens, So there would be a disruptions in supply, there would be a disruption in the trade. So that leads to an impact on the economy as well. So the crisis here are on the people, on the planet, and on the economy. Now, to tackle all of this, we should be finding something that's going to have a commonality and address all of these, if not fully, but in a combination way. And we can also see a lot of studies that have told or that have been advocating that there is a need to switch for alternative cereals. Okay, so you are able to see it before you that a lot of uncertainties in weather and rainfall is happening, and we are witnessing ourselves the impact of it. And every alternate year you find a drought, every alternate year there is a cyclone or a flood. So a lot of agrarian distress is likely to happen, and which calls for diversification. And this diversification actually means you are able to create a contingent crop for the farmers, a resilient food source, at the same time also balancing it. That leads us to the question of what is that we have to be choosing. So what are those alternative cereals? So what are those alternative cereals? Mentioned them, they are millets. There could be other alternatives, but millets dominate the entire alternative cereal system. I told you the problem of hunger, obesity. Likewise, we also face the problem of malnutrition. So in India, it remains one of the most pressing, but yet it's under discussed, or rather, it's not much debated thing. So you find more than 35.5% of the children under five and the age of 5 are stunted, and about 19% of them are suffering from wasting, and about 32% of them are underweight, and more than two-thirds children are anemic. So why this happens is because largely the food consumption in India is driven by affordability and not nutrition. So we feel if you are giving him enough food to eat, that's done. But actually, it's not the scenario. We should be giving them what they actually need. So largely the diets are dominated by rice and wheat, and of course that leads us to a situation where a deficiency is created. So definitely rice and wheat are adding the required nutrition that they have, but there is something that is still missing despite consuming the fullest quantity or calories that you are able to do. So that tells us that there is a missing gap even in the nutrition and on our plates. That further strengthens the argument that there is a need for alternative cereal both for the planet and as well as for our plates. That tells us to a question. So till either to or maybe till date, the question used to be like, how can we produce more food? Or maybe a century ago, if somebody would have asked what could be the goal, so producing enough food for people to eat was the biggest aim or goal that the governments or the organizations had. But today we are in a situation, we just don't need enough food, but rather we need something that is nutritious, something that is sustainable, something that is going to add value to the livelihoods, something that is going to be built without damaging the ecosystems. So the question today is, how can we produce the nutritious food without exhausting the water, without damaging the ecosystems, or weakening the farmer livelihoods? That precisely now lands us to a very few choices, or rather limited number of choices as to what could be those crops that fulfill all of these questions. So when I say millets, so millets are not one single crop. At least in India, we have about 9 types of millets cultivated. There is something called as pearl millet. We call them as bajra. There is something called as sorghum. There is something called as finger millet. There is a foxtail millet. There is a kodo millet, a little millet, proso millet, barnyard millet, and brown top millets. The millets are definitely the crops that constitute under millets are of these kinds in India. But if you go abroad, there are few more crops that are added to this list. It could be like teff, it could be like fonio, it could be job steers. So different geographies cultivate millets. The pool of them are called as millets, or in the global context, sorghum and millets separately. Okay, but in India, all of these nine crops together are called as millets. When you say millets, so there are different crops that we very well understand now, and all of them are able to be grown in different climates and possess different nutritional strengths. So it's not necessary that all of them possess the same nutritional strength. Say, for example, pearl millet could be rich in iron and zinc, when maybe sorghum might have higher fiber. Your ragi could have higher calcium. Okay, foxtail millet, kodo millet could have higher proteins. So likewise, each of the millets have their own strengths, and that is why we are treating them in combination. And the bottom line here is they are not one crop but a group of crops. So our efforts have to be there on all of these crops. Now, what makes them different? The moment people say they are the alternative cereals, so what makes them different is a question. The first point is, if people know of something called as a C3 and C4 pathways that happens in the photosynthesis, so millets rather process or have their metabolism through the C4 pathway, which means the photosynthesis here happens through a pathway called C4. This helps us to have a carbon concentration and probably makes them more resource efficient as opposed to the C3 crops. For example, rice and wheat, if you think, they are called as C3 pathways. So they undergo C3 pathway and they would be needing an additional, carbon dioxide, and then they would be needing favorable climates and hydroclimatic conditions to grow. Whereas the C4 crops normally perform better even in harsh conditions. So because they have a very low photorespiration, whereas the C3 has higher photorespiration. So that makes difference in case of millets. And definitely they are short duration crops, unlike a few crops with having 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, or even in crops like sugarcane, it is 1.5 years. So they are a very short duration crops, as low as 45 days, and then they are tolerant to drought and heat. So by far, whether in India or at the global level, if you observe, millets are largely cultivated in the marginal lands. They are very much, tolerant and resistant to drought and heat. So it's an inbuilt mechanism. Okay, it's not something that was designed in laboratories, unlike what we are doing for other crops today. So they have evolved over a period of time to tolerate drought and heat, and they perform very well in rain-fed areas. So most of the millets in India today are cultivated in rain-fed areas. So maybe you might find a very little or traces of regions where some irrigation is given, but otherwise maximum, in fact 90 to 95% of the millets in India or around the world are cultivated in rain-fed areas. They require low or no inputs, so you don't have to artificially give a lot of fertilizers and then pesticides and plant protection chemicals kind of things to them. So there is a concept called as LEA and LISA, right? Low external input agriculture, low external input sustainable agriculture. So probably millets are those that fit into both of these windows, and definitely they provide a lot of nutrition. So now we are able to understand what makes millets different from other cereals. So the moment you think of alternative cereals, here millets are your first choice. So the physiology, the root systems, the duration, all of them are able to help them regulate the water stress and makes millets a well suited choice to warm and water deficit regions.